Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter Stories. I am James Peter, your temporary host, because Mr. Peter is taking a well-deserved rest. Now, let me be clear. I can never replace Mr. Peter, but I promise to do my best to keep you entertained and satisfied. I'm just the narrator. The mastermind behind these incredible stories is still Mr. Peter himself. Before we dive in, let's start with a beautiful prayer for my family. Heavenly Father, I come before you with a heart full of gratitude, lifting up my beautiful family, each soul listening, each heart connected in love. Bless them abundantly, Lord. Let their homes be filled with peace, their minds with wisdom, and their hearts with joy. For those carrying burdens, lighten their load. For those feeling lost, guide them to their purpose. For those in pain, bring healing and comfort. Let love surround them like a shield, and may no harm come near them. Bless their dreams, their hard work, and their families. May every step they take lead them closer to happiness, success, and divine favor. Let kindness and goodness follow them all the days of their lives. Father, I pray that this moment reminds them that they are loved, cherished, and never alone. Keep them safe, strong, and always surrounded by your grace. Amen. Now, tell me, did you enjoy the last story? And are you here with me, fully present? Let me know in the comments. My beautiful family, please don't go anywhere. I promise you I won't skip the story. Just give me a little time and I promise I will never disappoint you. Stay with me and let's enjoy this journey together. All right, my family, let's begin. With love. Let's start the story. Nicole Peters hurried through the revolving doors of Silva Tower, shaking raindrops from her umbrella as water cascaded onto the polished marble floor. Outside, New York City disappeared behind sheets of torrential rain that fell in angry, slanting lines, transforming the streets into rushing rivers of reflected neon. Lightning split the darkened afternoon sky, followed by thunder that seemed to rattle the windows of the massive building, the sound reverberating through the cavernous lobby like a warning. She checked her watch, 3:45 p.m., 15 minutes early for her interview. Perfect. Despite her professional composure, she couldn't suppress a slight shiver that ran through her body, starting at her spine and radiating outward. The fever she'd been fighting all day was getting worse, her skin alternating between uncomfortable chills and flushed warmth that made her designer blouse cling to her skin. She had considered rescheduling, but opportunities at Silva Enterprises weren't offered twice. "I'm here to see Ms. Victoria Hayes, HR Director," she told the security guard, her voice steady despite her discomfort. She signed the visitor's log with practiced precision, her signature as confident as the resume that had earned her this coveted interview slot. The storm intensified as she rode the elevator to the 50th floor, the glass exterior elevator offering a panoramic view of the tempest. Raindrops streamed down the transparent walls like liquid silver, distorting the city below into an impressionist painting of blurred lights and shadows. Each flash of lightning transformed the skyline momentarily into a stark black and white photograph before plunging back into gray obscurity. Nicole straightened her crisp white blouse and adjusted her pencil skirt, studying her reflection in the mirrored interior walls of the elevator. At 28, with her confident posture, intelligent eyes, and the subtle elegance that came from taste rather than budget, she had already established herself as a marketing prodigy in smaller firms. But this position at Silva Enterprises could truly change everything, the culmination of years of relentless work and sacrifice. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the 50th floor. The reception area was tastefully appointed in minimalist style, all clean lines and muted colors that spoke of money that didn't need to announce itself. The receptionist, a perfectly groomed woman with an elegant headset, greeted Nicole with a practiced smile. Ms. Peters, Ms. Hayes will be ready for you shortly. Would you care for some water while you wait? Nicole accepted the offer, grateful for anything that might ease the scratchy dryness in her throat. As she sipped from the crystal tumbler, she gazed through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the storm that had transformed day into premature night. The clouds hung low and threatening, occasionally illuminated from within by lightning that revealed their churning, violent nature. Meanwhile, on the 52nd floor, Jonathan Silva remained oblivious to nature's fury outside his floor-to-ceiling windows. The occasional flash of lightning illuminated his focused expression as he hunched over financial projections, the blue light of his computer screen reflecting off his angular features. At 34, he had transformed his father's struggling company into a tech empire through a combination of brilliant innovation and ruthless efficiency. Yet personal connections remained his blind spot. Employees called him brilliant but cold. The business press had dubbed him the invisible billionaire for his avoidance of public appearances and his notorious privacy. The rain pounded against the windows with increasing intensity, each drop a tiny explosion against the glass. Wind howled around the corners of the building, creating an eerie whistling that served as background music to his solitary work. The storm seemed determined to demand his attention. But Jonathan remained focused, immune to distractions of any kind, a trait that had served him well in business but less so in life. "Sir," his assistant Victoria interrupted, her voice cutting through his concentration like a precisely aimed arrow. She stood in the doorway of his office, coat already buttoned, umbrella in hand. "I'm heading out. The weather service issued a severe storm warning, and most of the staff is leaving early." Jonathan nodded without looking up from his documents, his fingers continuing to type as he spoke. "The Nakamura acquisition proposal needs to be finalized tonight. I'll stay." Victoria hesitated, raindrops from her umbrella forming a small puddle at her feet on the immaculate hardwood floor. "There's one more interview scheduled for the marketing director position. Should I reschedule?" "Number, handle it and go. I need complete focus." His voice was clipped, efficient, revealing nothing of the man behind the executive persona. He had perfected the art of revealing exactly what was necessary and nothing more, another skill that had served his business interests well. Victoria nodded, accustomed to his abrupt manner. "The building may lose power if the storm continues to worsen. The backup generators will engage automatically," he finished for her. "I'm familiar with our infrastructure, Victoria. Good night." Hours later, as darkness fell completely outside, Nicole emerged from the HR office, exhilarated despite her worsening fever. The interview had gone brilliantly. Challenging questions met with insightful answers, her portfolio receiving appreciative nods from Victoria Hayes and the two department heads who had joined them. But now the building stood nearly empty, the storm having driven everyone home early. The overhead lights had been dimmed to energy-saving levels, casting long shadows across the deserted reception area. Nicole gathered her portfolio and made her way back to the elevator, her heels clicking on the marble floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the empty space. The building seemed to creak and groan around her as the wind battered its steel and glass exterior, the storm testing the limits of human engineering with its primordial fury. As she descended to the lobby, she could see through the glass walls of the elevator that the situation outside had deteriorated significantly. Streets that had merely been wet were now actively flooding, water swirling around abandoned vehicles. Trees bent at alarming angles, their branches whipping in the violent wind. In the lobby, the normally bustling space stood eerily empty except for a single security guard at the desk. Outside, the rain had become a biblical deluge. Through the lobby's glass walls, she could see water coursing down the streets, catching the neon lights of the city in its turbulent surface. Her phone showed no available Ubers, and the streets were flooding rapidly. A violent crack of thunder shook the building to its foundation as Nicole stood indecisively in the lobby, watching the storm rage with unrelenting fury. The security guard looked up from his monitors with concern. "Ma'am, you might want to consider waiting it out. Weather Service says it's going to get worse before it gets better. They're reporting power outages across the city." Nicole nodded, feeling another wave of feverish heat wash over her as she contemplated her limited options. The thought of navigating flooded streets with her rising fever seemed increasingly unwise. As she stood there, the lights flickered ominously, a brief reminder of the fragility of modern convenience in the face of nature's power. Chapter 2. Elevator Entrapment. By midnight, Jonathan finally set aside the acquisition paperwork, his eyes burning from hours of staring at spreadsheets and legal documents. The storm had reached new heights of fury, rattling the windows of his office with a violence that finally penetrated his concentration. Wind shrieked around the corners of the building like a living entity, occasionally punctuated by thunderclaps that seemed to shake the very foundation of the tower. He stood and stretched, his tall frame casting a long shadows across the dimly lit office. The storm created an ever-changing pattern of light and shadow as lightning flashed at irregular intervals, briefly illuminating the rain-streaked windows before plunging the room back into semi-darkness. Despite the ferocity outside, Jonathan decided to call it a night. He had accomplished what he needed to, and even he recognized the folly of trying to drive through what the news alerts were now calling the worst storm in a decade. As he gathered his things, placing documents methodically into his leather briefcase, a particularly violent thunderclap rattled the building, causing the lights to flicker. For a moment he paused, contemplating the possibility of being trapped in darkness, but the backup generators would activate if needed. Silva Tower's infrastructure was top of the line, designed to withstand far worse than a summer thunderstorm, no matter how dramatic. Jonathan took the executive elevator down to the lobby, expecting to find the building entirely empty at this hour. As the doors opened onto the cavernous space, he was startled to find a woman standing near the reception desk, looking anxiously out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the tempest beyond. Her silhouette was striking against the backdrop of rain and occasional lightning, a study in elegant tension. "The building should be empty," he said, his social awkwardness immediately apparent in the abruptness of his words. He hadn't intended to sound accusatory, but years of limiting his interactions to structured business settings had left him ill-equipped for unexpected social encounters. Nicole turned at the sound of his voice, recognition dawning immediately. Jonathan Silva was impossible to mistake. His features had graced enough business magazines and technology websites that she would have known him anywhere. In person, he seemed taller than in photographs, his presence filling the space in a way images couldn't capture. Despite his reputation for coldness, she noticed an unexpected vulnerability in his eyes, quickly masked as he straightened his already impeccable posture. "Mr. Silva, I'm Nicole Peters. I interviewed for the marketing director position today. I've been waiting for the storm to let up, but it's only getting worse." She gestured toward the windows where the rain continued its relentless assault, water cascading down the glass in sheets that distorted the view of the flooded streets beyond. Jonathan shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tightening imperceptibly on the handle of his briefcase. Human interactions outside of structured business meetings always left him feeling exposed, unprepared. He preferred the clear parameters of corporate negotiations, where everyone's motives were transparent, usually financial, and emotions remained irrelevant. "Is security aware you're still here?" he asked, glancing toward the empty security desk. The guard went to check something in the basement. The lobby monitors were showing some kind of alert. Nicole brushed a strand of hair from her face, and Jonathan noticed the slight flush to her cheeks, the brightness of her eyes that suggested she might be unwell. A flash of lightning illuminated the lobby, followed almost instantly by a deafening crack of thunder that seemed to explode directly overhead. The lights flickered more dramatically this time, dimming for several seconds before stabilizing again. "Could you possibly give me a ride?" Nicole asked, her usual confidence tempered by desperation. A shiver ran through her despite her efforts to appear composed. "I've tried getting an Uber for hours, but with the flooding—" Jonathan hesitated. Under normal circumstances, he would have politely declined, maintaining the professional distance he carefully preserved with all employees and associates. But the storm outside was genuinely dangerous, and she did appear to be ill. Liability concerns aside, basic humanity dictated he couldn't leave her stranded. Yes. "Fine," he replied curtly, avoiding eye contact as they walked toward the elevator that would take them to the underground parking garage. The descent began smoothly, the soft hum of the elevator mechanisms a stark contrast to the violence of the storm they had witnessed above. Nicole noticed how Jonathan kept to the opposite corner, his tall frame tense as if bracing for impact, his eyes fixed on the changing floor numbers rather than on her. Floor 40, 39, 38. The rain created a hypnotic pattern against the glass wall of the elevator, individual droplets racing each other down the transparent surface, merging and separating in an ever-changing dance. Outside, the city was transformed into a watery dreamscape, buildings emerging from the deluge like islands in a turbulent sea, their lights refracted and multiplied by the water. At floor 37, a deafening crack of thunder coincided with a flash of lightning so bright it seemed to burn through the glass, momentarily blinding them both. The elevator jerked violently, then stopped with a shuddering finality that left them both slightly off balance. The lights flickered once, twice, then died completely, plunging them into absolute darkness. "What happened?" Nicole asked, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Years of presenting to tough clients had taught her to control her voice, even when anxiety threatened to overwhelm her. "Power surge. Probably hit the main line," Jonathan responded, his own voice remarkably calm as he fumbled for his phone. The screen illuminated his face in the darkness, casting sharp shadows that accentuated his strong jawline and the furrow between his brows as he studied the display. "No service." Nicole checked her own phone, the blue light creating a small island of illumination in the darkness. "Same here." She tried not to think about how small the elevator suddenly felt, or how the air seemed instantly thicker, warmer. Jonathan pressed the emergency call button repeatedly, his frustration evident in the increasing force of his finger against the unresponsive panel. Nothing. Not even the reassuring glow of the button itself, which should have been battery-powered regardless of the main electrical supply. "The backup generators should kick in soon," he said, though uncertainty tinged his voice. He had overseen the installation of the system himself, but theory and practice were often separated by the unpredictable variables of reality. Outside, through the glass wall of the elevator, they could see that the entire city had gone dark. The familiar skyline, usually a tapestry of light against the night sky, had vanished, replaced by an almost primeval darkness, broken only by the occasional flash of lightning that revealed the continuing fury of the storm. Minutes stretched to an hour. The temperature in the small space began to drop as the building's heating system remained offline. Outside, the storm continued its assault, visible only when lightning briefly illuminated the sky through the small window in the elevator door, casting dramatic shadows across their faces before plunging them back into darkness. The rain hammered against the glass with unrelenting force, creating a constant background rhythm to their shared captivity. Occasionally, a gust of wind would drive the rain into new patterns, the droplets striking the glass like tiny bullets before streaming downward in rivulets that resembled tears. "I don't think anyone's coming tonight," Nicole finally said, sliding down to sit on the floor, her professional skirt arranged carefully around her. The fever that had been threatening all day was now making itself fully known, alternating waves of heat and chills that made staying upright increasingly difficult. Jonathan remained standing for a moment longer, as if surrendering to their situation required a formal decision. Finally, he too lowered himself to the floor, maintaining a careful distance between them. His precisely tailored suit was not designed for sitting on elevator floors, but he arranged himself with as much dignity as possible, his back straight against the wall. "The security team does rounds at 6 a.m. Worst case, we're here for 6 more hours," he said, checking his watch by the light of his phone screen. The blue glow softened his features momentarily, revealing a glimpse of the man beneath the corporate armor. Nicole nodded, then suddenly sneezed, the sound startlingly loud in the confined space. "Are you ill?" Jonathan asked, concern momentarily overriding his discomfort with personal questions. Even in the dim light, he could see the unnatural brightness of her eyes, the flush that had spread across her cheekbones. "Just a slight fever. I'll be fine," she assured him, though another shiver betrayed her as the temperature continued to drop. Outside, the rain seemed to be falling even harder, sheets of water cascading down the glass wall of the elevator, transforming the world beyond into a distorted, liquid version of reality. As the night deepened around them, the small elevator became increasingly uncomfortable. The initial awkwardness of their situation began to give way to the more pressing concerns of physical discomfort and the growing uncertainty of when they might be rescued. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating, its fury a constant reminder of nature's power to disrupt even the most carefully constructed human environments. In the darkness, with only the occasional flash of lightning to break the monotony, time seemed to stretch and distort. Minutes felt like hours, yet somehow the hours themselves passed with surprising speed. The rain continued its relentless percussion against the glass, a soundtrack to their unexpected confinement that was both soothing and maddening in its constancy. Jonathan checked his watch again. 12:47 a.m. The night stretched before them, long and uncertain, filled with the sound of rain and the growing awareness of each other's presence in the confined space. Neither could have predicted how the hours ahead would transform them both, nor how this accidental intimacy would ultimately reshape their carefully constructed worlds. Chapter 3. Breaking Barriers. 3 hours into their entrapment, the conversation had moved from awkward small talk to something approaching genuine dialogue. The darkness somehow made it easier to speak freely, removing the visual cues and expressions that often caused Jonathan to retreat behind his professional facade. In the black velvet cocoon of the elevator, with only occasional flashes of lightning providing brief glimpses of each other's faces, words flowed more easily than either had expected. The storm continued its symphony against the glass wall, sometimes diminishing to a gentle patter before surging again with renewed fury, raindrops exploding against the transparent surface like tiny meteors. The sound created a strange sense of intimacy, as if they were the only two people left in a world overwhelmed by water and darkness. "So you've really never taken a day off in 5 years?" Nicole asked, her voice now familiar in the darkness. Her initial professional reserve had gradually melted away, replaced by genuine curiosity about this enigmatic man whose reputation for brilliance was matched only by rumors of his isolation. Jonathan shifted, their shoulders almost touching as they sat side by side against the wall. The slight contact sent an unexpected warmth through him, a sensation he quickly dismissed as merely physical, a natural response to the dropping temperature in the elevator. "The company doesn't run itself," he replied, though without the defensive edge that typically accompanied such statements. In the darkness, without the need to maintain his carefully constructed image, he found himself answering more honestly than he might have in daylight. "There's always something that requires attention." "What about before the company? Surely you had hobbies, friends?" Her voice trailed off as another flash of lightning briefly illuminated the small space, revealing Jonathan's expression, thoughtful rather than guarded, his usual mask momentarily abandoned. A long pause followed, filled only by the sound of rain against glass, the occasional distant rumble of thunder that seemed to be moving farther away. Water streaked down the transparent wall in rivulets that caught the dim emergency lighting from outside, creating abstract patterns that shifted and changed like living art. I was a different person then, Jonathan finally said, his voice softer than Nicole had heard it before. Painfully shy, more comfortable with code than people. Building this company gave me purpose, structure. The rain intensified again, a fresh wave of droplets creating a crescendo against the glass. Each drop caught what little light remained, transforming into tiny prisms that scattered microscopic rainbows across the elevator walls before sliding downward in streams that resembled tears. Structure is comfortable, safe, Nicole observed, drawing her knees up to her chest. The movement brought her slightly closer to Jonathan, close enough that she could detect the subtle scent of his cologne, something expensive but understated, like the man himself. Precisely, he agreed, surprising himself with how easily he was sharing thoughts he rarely acknowledged even privately. What about you? Why marketing? Outside, the storm painted the world in varying shades of darkness, sometimes lifting enough to reveal the shadowy outlines of nearby buildings, other times closing in so completely that it seemed they might be floating in space rather than suspended 37 floors above Manhattan. I love understanding what moves people, what connects them, Nicole replied, her voice taking on a warmth that suggested genuine passion rather than rehearsed interview answers. A flash of lightning illuminated her face briefly, her eyes bright with intelligence and something more vulnerable, perhaps fever, perhaps emotion. I started analyzing advertising campaigns when I was 14. While other kids were watching music videos, I was deconstructing the psychological triggers in commercials, figuring out why certain messages resonated while others fell flat. She shifted slightly, her professional guard lowering in the darkness. My father was a corporate attorney who believed emotional intelligence was secondary to analytical thinking. He pushed me toward law, a respectable profession. But I saw how companies failed not because their products were inferior, but because they couldn't connect with their audience. The human element was always the missing piece. Her voice took on a subtle edge of determination. I built my career proving that understanding people isn't soft science. It's the hardest science there is, and the most valuable. Rain continued its liquid melody against the glass, sometimes gentle, sometimes furious. Nature's passion made audible. The varying rhythm created a hypnotic backdrop to their conversation, somehow making the silence between words comfortable rather than awkward. Another violent crack of thunder rattled the elevator. Nicole's fever had worsened, and she couldn't suppress a violent shiver that ran through her entire body. The temperature had dropped significantly as the hours passed, the absence of heating making the small space increasingly uncomfortable. "You're freezing," Jonathan observed, hearing the slight chatter of her teeth, despite her attempt to hide her discomfort. "Just the fever." "I'll be fine," she insisted, though another shiver betrayed her as she wrapped her arms more tightly around herself. Outside, the rain had briefly subsided to a gentle patter, individual droplets now visible as they traced slow paths down the glass, rather than the solid sheets of water that had dominated earlier. After a moment's hesitation, Jonathan removed his suit jacket, the rustling of expensive fabric loud in the confined space. He cautiously offered it to her, the gesture awkward and unpracticed. "Take it, please." Their fingers brushed as she accepted the jacket, and Jonathan felt an unfamiliar jolt at the contact, a small electric current that traveled up his arm and settled somewhere in his chest. Nicole wrapped herself in the expensive wool, immediately enveloped in warmth and a subtle cologne she found unexpectedly appealing. The jacket was far too large for her slender frame, but the weight of it felt oddly comforting, like an embrace. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice slightly muffled as she pulled the collar up around her neck. Another flash of lightning briefly illuminated her face, gratitude mixed with something unreadable in her expression, before darkness reclaimed the space. Outside, the rain began to intensify again, driven sideways now by gusts of wind that howled around the building's corners. The water struck the glass with renewed force, creating a chaotic pattern that seemed to mirror the increasingly complex emotions developing in the small space. As the night progressed and rain continued its ceaseless rhythm against the glass, they shared more personal stories. Jonathan described growing up with a demanding father who saw his introversion as weakness, who pushed him relentlessly toward success while never acknowledging the cost. The rain provided punctuation to his words, sometimes gentle, as if listening, other times fierce, as if emphasizing the emotion he worked so hard to contain. Nicole talked about putting herself through college while supporting her younger siblings after their parents' accident. Her words painted pictures of determination and sacrifice, illuminated occasionally by flashes of lightning that revealed the strength in her expression, the pride that came from overcoming rather than being given. "We're both overachievers, then," Nicole observed with a small laugh that somehow brightened the darkness. "Just for different reasons." "Different paths to the same place," Jonathan agreed, his voice softer than it had been hours before. Another rumble of thunder emphasized his words, the storm seeming to respond to their conversation with its own commentary. The rain created ever-changing patterns against the glass wall, sometimes resembling tears, sometimes stars, sometimes nothing recognizable at all. Just water finding its inevitable path downward. Inside the elevator, another kind of inevitability was taking shape as the carefully maintained distance between them had gradually disappeared. Now their shoulders touched comfortably, neither moving away from the contact. Nicole's head occasionally dipped toward Jonathan's shoulder when exhaustion momentarily overcame her before she caught herself and straightened again. Outside, the storm continued its liquid symphony, sometimes crescendoing with dramatic thunderclaps, other times diminishing to a gentle patter that resembled whispered secrets. Time lost meaning in the darkness, marked only by the changing patterns of rain against glass and the gradually deepening conversation between two people who had begun the night as strangers. The water outside transformed the world into something fluid and dreamlike, while inside something equally transformative was occurring, boundaries dissolving, walls crumbling, with only the rain as witness. "It's strange," Nicole said softly, breaking a comfortable silence that had settled between them. "I feel like I know you better after a few hours here than people I've worked with for years." "Perhaps that's the difference between being seen and being watched," Jonathan replied, surprising himself with the insight. Outside, the rain had slowed momentarily, individual droplets now visible as they traced lazy patterns down the glass. Lightning flashed again, briefly illuminating their faces. Both turned toward each other now, the professional masks from earlier in the evening completely abandoned. In that brief moment of illumination, something passed between them, recognition, understanding, possibility, before darkness reclaimed the space, leaving only the sound of rain and their increasingly synchronized breathing. In the small elevator suspended between earth and sky, surrounded by darkness and rain, two people who had begun the night as strangers continued their unexpected journey toward something neither could have anticipated. Outside, water continued to transform the world into something fluid and uncertain, while inside another kind of transformation was taking place, just as profound, just as inevitable as water finding its path to the sea. Chapter 4. undeniable chemistry. Around 3 a.m., the temperature had dropped further. Outside, the rain continued its relentless assault, though the pattern had changed. No longer the violent sheets of water from earlier, but a steady hypnotic rhythm that created a constant background to their shared isolation. Occasionally, wind would drive the raindrops into new formations against the glass, creating abstract patterns that resembled star charts or ancient writing, momentarily visible before dissolving back into chaos. Nicole's fever alternated between chills and heat, making her increasingly uncomfortable despite Jonathan's jacket wrapped around her shoulders. The expensive wool retained his body heat and subtle cologne, creating a strange intimacy even when they weren't speaking. She tried to suppress another shiver, but her body betrayed her as cold seemed to penetrate to her bones. "You should try to sleep," Jonathan suggested, his voice now a low rumble in the darkness. Hours of conversation had softened his usual clipped tone, revealing a depth and warmth he rarely allowed others to perceive. "Too cold," she admitted, pulling the jacket tighter around herself. The rain outside created moving shadows across her face as water streaked down the glass wall, catching what little ambient light remained in the darkened city. Jonathan hesitated, weighing options in the methodical way he approached all problems. The logical solution was obvious, yet it required crossing boundaries he had maintained his entire adult life. After a moment's calculation, practicality won over personal comfort. "Body heat," he explained awkwardly, cautiously placing his arm around her shoulders. "Practical solution." The rain seemed to intensify at that moment, large droplets striking the glass with renewed force, creating a liquid percussion that masked the sudden acceleration of his heartbeat. Water streamed down the transparent wall in rivulets that resembled nervous fingers, mirroring the uncertainty of his gesture. Nicole hesitated, her own heart racing for reasons she attributed to her fever. Professional boundaries had always been sacrosanct in her career, never compromised, never questioned. Yet here, suspended in darkness with the rain creating a world apart from reality, those boundaries seemed increasingly irrelevant. She leaned into him, her body fitting against his with surprising naturalness, her head eventually resting against his chest. "Very practical," she murmured, too exhausted to maintain professional distance. His heartbeat was strong and slightly fast beneath her ear, creating a counterpoint to the rhythm of rain against glass. Jonathan went rigid at first, unaccustomed to physical contact. The warmth of her body against his created sensations he had almost forgotten were possible. Comfort, connection, something more primitive that he quickly suppressed. Gradually he relaxed, finding her presence against him strangely comforting rather than intrusive. Her hair smelled of jasmine, and the rise and fall of her breathing created a rhythm he found himself matching unconsciously. Outside, the rain continued its liquid commentary, sometimes gentle as if approving, other times fierce as if emphasizing the significance of boundaries crossed. Water traced patterns down the glass that resembled tears, stars, rivers, constantly changing yet somehow consistent in their downward journey. A particularly violent crash of thunder shook the elevator, startling them both. The sound vibrated through the metal structure, followed by a flash of electrical blue that illuminated the small space in stark relief before plunging it back into complete darkness. The building seemed to shudder in response, creaking sounds from the superstructure amplifying the sense of vulnerability. Nicole instinctively gripped his shirt, turning her face toward his. In the brief flash of lightning that illuminated the small space, their eyes met properly for the first time since darkness had fallen. The electricity of the storm outside seemed to find its echo in the charged air between them, creating a moment of perfect stillness amid chaos. Time seemed suspended in that moment of illumination. Jonathan felt his heart racing in a way no business negotiation had ever triggered, his carefully constructed walls crumbling beneath the simple weight of her gaze. Nicole found herself drawn to the vulnerability suddenly visible in his usually guarded expression, seeing the man rather than the CEO with perfect clarity in that flash of brightness. The rain created a curtain of water against the glass wall, transforming the world beyond into a liquid dream where normal rules seemed suspended. Inside, another kind of transformation was occurring as the distance between them, physical, emotional, professional, dissolved completely. Neither could say who moved first. Perhaps it was simultaneous, his hand gently touching her face, her fingers curling around his collar. Their lips met tentatively at first, questioning, then with increasing certainty as the initial shock gave way to recognition of something both unexpected and somehow inevitable. The kiss deepened as the rain intensified outside, water streaming down glass in sheets that isolated them completely from the world beyond. Lightning flashed again, illuminating them briefly. Her hands now tangled in his hair, his arms wrapped around her with protective urgency, before darkness reclaimed them, leaving only sensation and the sound of rain. For Jonathan, the sensation was entirely new. He had dated occasionally, always brief, controlled relationships that never progressed beyond superficial connection. This, this was something elemental, beyond his ability to analyze or control. The taste of her lips, the softness of her skin beneath his fingers, the small sounds she made as he pulled her closer, all combined to create a kind of intoxication he had never experienced before. Nicole felt the fever in her blood transform into something else entirely as his hands tangled in her hair, traced the curve of her spine, pulled her against him with increasing urgency. The professional boundaries she had always carefully maintained dissolved completely in the heat between them, washed away by the rain outside and the flood of sensations within. Against the backdrop of the storm's fury, they surrendered to a different kind of tempest. The confined space of the elevator became an intimate world where only they existed, exploring each other with increasing passion as the night deepened around them. The rain provided a constant soundtrack to their discovery, sometimes gentle, sometimes wild, always fluid and changing. In the darkness, clothes became obstacles, discarded with urgent hands. Nicole's blouse, his crisp shirt, her skirt, each removal another barrier broken between them. The rain created moving shadows across bare skin as water continued to stream down the glass wall, occasionally illuminated by distant lightning that revealed glimpses of their entwined forms before returning them to the privacy of darkness. Their bodies moved together on the floor of the elevator, finding rhythm in the chaos of sensation and emotion. The storm outside seemed to respond to their passion, rain increasing in intensity until it struck the glass like thousands of tiny fists demanding entrance to witness what transpired within. Lightning flashed with increasing frequency, brief glimpses of reality in a night that had become dreamlike in its intensity. For hours they lost themselves completely, the storm outside a distant echo of the one they created between them. Jonathan, always controlled, found himself undone by her touch, surrendering to sensations he had denied himself for years in pursuit of success and safety. Nicole discovered depths of passion she had never experienced before, her usual composure abandoned completely in the face of something that felt inevitable, necessary, right. When they finally lay breathless in each other's arms, the storm had begun to subside, rain gentling to a soft patter against the glass. Their bodies tangled together on the floor of the elevator, her head resting on his chest, his arms wrapped protectively around her. Outside, water continued to streak down the transparent wall, but slower now, individual droplets tracing lazy patterns in the first hint of pre-dawn light. Reality remained comfortably distant, held at bay by darkness and the continued isolation of their unexpected sanctuary. Nicole listened to Jonathan's heartbeat, gradually slowing beneath her ear, matching her own as their breathing synchronized. His fingers traced abstract patterns on her bare shoulder, as if trying to memorize the texture of her skin. "I never do this," she whispered, breaking the silence that had settled between them after passion had subsided into tender exhaustion. "Neither do I," he replied, his voice different now, deeper, unguarded, honest in a way it had never been in boardrooms or interviews. Outside, the rain had almost stopped, only occasional droplets striking the glass, reluctant tears from clouds that had spent their fury and now watched in gentle melancholy as night prepared to surrender to dawn. Inside, two people who had begun the night as strangers held each other in the comfortable silence that follows true connection, neither willing to acknowledge the approaching reality that waited beyond their temporary sanctuary. For now, the rain-washed darkness was enough, a moment suspended between what had been and what would be, filled with nothing but the sound of synchronized breathing and the occasional drop of water against glass, marking time in a world that existed only for them. Chapter 5. Dawn Revelations. The first hints of emergency lighting flickered on at 5:30 a.m., casting a pale blue glow through the elevator. The sudden illumination, however faint, felt intrusive after hours of intimate darkness, like a spotlight on a scene never meant for public viewing. Outside, the rain had diminished to a gentle patter, occasional droplets striking the glass with diminishing urgency, as if the storm itself was exhausted after its hours of fury. Nicole stirred from where she had been sleeping against Jonathan's chest, their bodies still intertwined on the floor of the elevator. The thin emergency light caught the curve of her shoulder, the tangle of her hair, the soft vulnerability of her expression as consciousness gradually returned. For a moment she remained still, absorbing the reality of their situation. Her body pressed against his arm curved protectively around her waist, the scattered clothing that told the story of their night together. Reality crashed in with the light, harsh and uncompromising after the fluid dream world of darkness and rain. They disentangled hastily, retreating to opposite sides of the small space, as if physical distance might somehow undo the intimacy they had shared hours before. The blue emergency light was merciless, revealing the dishevelment of clothing, the marks of passion barely hidden beneath collars and cuffs, the undeniable evidence of boundaries completely abandoned. "I," Jonathan began, then stopped, seemingly at a loss. Words that had flowed so easily in darkness now failed him completely in the revealing light of dawn. His fingers fumbled with buttons, his usually precise movements clumsy with haste and regret. Outside, a final few raindrops traced slow paths down the glass, like reluctant tears mourning the night's passing. Nicole smoothed her hair, professional mask sliding back into place, despite the intimacy they'd shared hours before. The transformation was remarkable. Within moments, she had reassembled not just her clothing, but her entire persona, armor reconstructed piece by piece, until only her slightly swollen lips suggested anything unusual had transpired. "It's okay," she said, her voice controlled, measured, nothing like the passionate whispers that had filled the darkness. "Extraordinary circumstances." Something flickered in Jonathan's eyes. Hurt? Relief? Regret? The emergency lighting cast strange shadows across his features, making his expression even more unreadable than usual. He nodded curtly, rebuttoning his shirt with methodical precision that belied the trembling of his fingers. "Of course." The words hung between them, inadequate and somehow cruel in their dismissal of what had passed between them. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, leaving only the evidence of its passage. Water still streaming down windows throughout the city, streets glistening with reflected light as the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky. The elevator jerked suddenly, then began moving again. The main power had returned, bringing with it all the structures and boundaries of the world they had temporarily escaped. They finished dressing in tense silence, a gulf widening between them with each passing second, each fastened button, each smoothed wrinkle. By the time the elevator reached the lobby floor, it contained two strangers again, a CEO and a job applicant, positions clearly defined, boundaries firmly re-established. When the doors finally opened, maintenance staff and security guards waited with concerned expressions. The storm had caused significant damage throughout the city. Power outages, flooding, even structural damage to some older buildings. Silva Tower, with its cutting-edge infrastructure, had weathered the night better than most, but not without its own challenges. "Mr. Silva, are you all right, sir?" the head of security asked, genuine concern evident in his voice. His eyes flickered briefly to Nicole, surprise and something else, speculation, perhaps, crossing his features before his professional mask returned. "Fine," Jonathan replied, his CEO persona firmly back in place. The transformation was complete. No hint remained of the vulnerable, passionate man who had whispered intimate confessions against Nicole's skin hours before. Now he stood straight, distant, untouchable, the invisible billionaire once again. "Miss Peters was here for an interview yesterday and got stranded by the storm. Please arrange transportation for her." He turned to Nicole, his expression unreadable, not a flicker of recognition for what had transpired between them. "Thank you for your patience during this unfortunate situation. HR will be in touch about the position." Without waiting for her response, he strode toward the exit where his driver already waited, engine running as if the night had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience in his carefully scheduled life. His shoes left wet prints on the marble floor, the only evidence that he, like the city around them, had been touched by the storm's passage. Nicole watched him go, a complicated mixture of emotions churning inside her. Just hours ago, they had shared something profound. Or had it been merely physical, a product of unusual circumstances and proximity? His dismissal stung more than she cared to admit, even to herself. She accepted the offer of a company car with gracious professionalism, betraying nothing of her inner turmoil to the curious security staff. As the car navigated streets still bearing evidence of the night's tempest, fallen branches, scattered debris, puddles that reflected the lightening sky, Nicole stared out the window, unseeing. The city was waking, returning to its normal rhythms after the storm's interruption, just as she would need to return to her own carefully constructed life, her career ambitions, her professional goals. The night in the elevator already seemed dreamlike in its intensity and disconnection from reality. 3 days later, she received the job offer, marketing director at Silva Enterprises, reporting directly to the executive team. The salary was even higher than discussed in her interview, the benefits package exceptional even by industry standards. The email was formal, businesslike, signed by Victoria Hayes rather than Jonathan himself. No hint that anything unusual had transpired, no acknowledgement of the storm or the elevator or the boundaries crossed. After careful consideration, weighing professional opportunity against personal complication, Nicole accepted. The rational part of her recognized Silva Enterprises as the career opportunity she had been working toward for years. The irrational part, the part that still felt the ghost of Jonathan's touch when rain struck windows, the part that woke breathless from dreams of darkness and connection, that part hoped for something more, something undefined that lingered in the space between professional ambition and personal desire. As she composed her acceptance email, rain began to fall again outside her apartment window. A gentle spring shower, nothing like the tempest that had changed everything. Droplets traced delicate patterns down the glass, catching light from her desk lamp and transforming it into tiny constellations that appeared and vanished in moments. Nicole watched them, remembering another rain against another glass wall, and wondered what awaited her at Silva Enterprises, whether the night in the elevator had been an ending or a beginning. A memory to be forgotten or the first chapter of something not yet defined. The rain continued as she pressed send, water streaming down glass in ever-changing patterns that suggested possibility, transformation, the fluid nature of boundaries once thought immutable. Outside, the city received the gentle shower with gratitude after days of rebuilding, water cleansing away the last evidence of the previous storm's fury, preparing the landscape for whatever might come next. Chapter 6. Corporate Tensions. 1 month into her new role, Nicole was already redefining what marketing meant at Silva Enterprises. Where previous campaigns had focused on technical specifications and feature comparisons, her approach emphasized the human impact of quantum computing, the medical breakthroughs, climate solutions, and scientific discoveries their technology enabled. This shift had generated unprecedented pre-launch buzz for their new processor, with mainstream publications covering technology that would previously have been discussed only in specialist journals. The executive team, with the notable exception of Jonathan, had embraced her vision enthusiastically. Board members who had initially questioned her rapid promotion now cited her work when discussing the company's expanding market position. Spring had settled over Manhattan, bringing with it the city's renewal. Window boxes filled with new blooms, the fresh energy of pedestrians freed from winter coats, the softening of the urban landscape as trees budded in every park. But each time the skies darkened and rain fell, both Nicole and Jonathan found themselves momentarily transported back to that night. The unexpected intimacy, the confessions shared in darkness, the connection that had formed and then been deliberately buried beneath professional veneers. Jonathan had maintained professional distance, their interactions limited to group meetings where he treated her with the same cool efficiency he showed everyone. If colleagues noticed the occasional moment when their eyes met a beat too long, or the careful way they never found themselves alone together, no one mentioned it. In the corporate world, such observations remained currency to be spent at opportune moments rather than acknowledged directly. No one except Victoria Hayes. The HR director had developed an immediate dislike for Nicole, sensing a shift in the company's atmosphere since her arrival. It wasn't just the success of her marketing initiatives or the way other executives increasingly sought her input on matters beyond her department's purview. It was something more subtle, the way Jonathan sometimes lost his train of thought when Nicole entered a room, the way his eyes followed her movements when he thought no one was watching, the almost imperceptible softening of his voice when addressing her directly. The tension came to a head on a particularly rainy Thursday evening. Most of the staff had departed early, concerned about flash flood warnings that had been issued for parts of the city. Nicole remained in her office, finalizing a presentation for the next morning's meeting, her concentration occasionally broken by the sound of rain against her window. Each droplet a tiny reminder of another storm, another night. "Mr. Silva needs these projections reviewed by morning," Victoria announced, appearing in Nicole's doorway without knocking. She dropped a thick folder on the desk with a thud that seemed calculated to disrupt. Outside, rain streaked down the windows in sheets, transforming the city beyond into a watery impression of itself. Nicole glanced at the folder, noting the financial data that had nothing to do with her department's functions. "These aren't marketing materials." "He specifically requested you," Victoria replied with a thin smile that never reached her eyes. Rain continued its percussion against the windows, providing an ominous backdrop to the conversation. "Unless you're not up to the task." The challenge hung in the air between them, as tangible as the humidity that had accompanied the day's storms. Nicole met Victoria's gaze steadily, refusing to reveal the uncertainty beneath her professional composure. "Of course, I'll have them on his desk first thing." After Victoria left, Nicole flipped through the complex financial documents, recognizing it as busy work intended to keep her at the office late. A test of dedication, perhaps, or simply a power play. With a sigh, she settled in for a long night, the sound of rain against glass both distraction and strange comfort as she worked. Near midnight, she delivered the completed analysis to Jonathan's office, expecting to leave it with his assistant. Instead, she found him still working, silhouetted against the rain-streaked windows, the city lights beyond creating a halo effect around his tall frame. The storm had intensified again, water now pounding against the glass with renewed fury, as if demanding entrance to witness what transpired within. "You're still here," he said, looking up in surprise as she entered. The late hour and empty building had allowed him to relax his rigid posture slightly, and something of the man from the elevator was visible in his expression, vulnerability quickly masked, but not before she had glimpsed it. "So are you," she countered, placing the folder on his desk. Rain created moving shadows across both their faces, water streaming down the windows in patterns that resembled tears, or perhaps maps to places neither was willing to acknowledge. Victoria said this was urgent. Jonathan frowned, opening the folder and scanning its contents with the quick comprehension that had built his empire. "I never asked for this." Their eyes met, understanding passing between them. Victoria was testing her, perhaps trying to create friction between them, or simply asserting her own position in the corporate hierarchy. The rain provided a soundtrack to their realization, constant, insistent, impossible to ignore. "I see," Nicole said softly, her professional mask slipping slightly to reveal the woman beneath, the one who had whispered intimate confessions against his skin during another storm, another night. Jonathan stood, moving around the desk until they were face to face. For a moment, the electricity from that night in the elevator crackled between them, heightened by the storm outside that echoed the one they had weathered together. Rain pounded against the windows with increasing intensity, driven sideways by gusts of wind that howled around the building's corners. "Nicole, about what happened?" he began, his carefully controlled facade slipping for a moment to reveal genuine emotion beneath. His hand lifted slightly as if to touch her face before dropping back to his side. "It's fine," she interrupted, unable to bear whatever dismissal might follow. The rain seemed to intensify at that moment, water striking glass with percussive force that matched her heartbeat. "We're professionals. It was an unusual situation." "Is that all it was to you?" he asked, his voice dropping to the intimate tone she remembered from darkness and shared vulnerability. Outside, lightning flashed, briefly illuminating them both in stark relief, two people standing on the edge of something undefined, uncertain whether to step back or forward. Before she could answer, his office door opened. Victoria stood there, surprise quickly masked by a professional smile that didn't touch her eyes. She was perfectly groomed despite the late hour and the storm raging outside, her appearance calculated to highlight the contrast with Nicole's slightly disheveled state after hours of work. "Oh, I didn't realize you were in a meeting," she said smoothly, though her expression suggested she had known exactly what she might interrupt. Rain continued to stream down the windows behind them, creating a liquid backdrop to the scene. Three figures caught in a moment of tension that extended beyond professional boundaries. "Just delivering the reports you requested," Nicole replied, stepping back from Jonathan. The professional mask slid back into place with practiced ease, though her heart continued to race with emotions she refused to acknowledge. "Good night, Mr. Silva." As she left, she felt Victoria's calculating gaze following her and knew that navigating Silva Enterprises had just become considerably more complicated. The storm outside continued its assault on the building, rain streaming down glass in patterns that seemed to whisper warnings about the tempest gathering within, one that might prove far more dangerous than mere water and wind. In her office, gathering her things to leave, Nicole paused at the window. The city below was partially obscured by sheets of rain, lights blurred into smears of color that pulsed and shifted with each gust of wind. The view reminded her of that night in the elevator, a world transformed by water and darkness into something fluid, dreamlike, where normal boundaries cease to apply. But this was not a dream, and the boundaries here were real. Professional lines that could destroy careers if crossed, personal limits that protected against vulnerability and pain. As she watched the storm continue its assault on the city, Nicole wondered which would prove more powerful in the end, the rational structures they had built to contain themselves, or the elemental forces that had revealed themselves during another rain, another night. Behind her, lightning flashed, casting her shadow large against the wall, a momentary giant dwarfing the office furniture before returning to human scale as darkness reclaimed the space. Outside, rain continued to fall, each droplet carrying its own momentum, its own inevitable path downward, combining with others to create streams, rivers, floods, forces of nature that no human structure, no matter how carefully designed, could permanently contain. Chapter 7. Sabotage. 2 months later, Nicole had become invaluable to Silva Enterprises, her department consistently exceeding targets. The marketing division, once considered merely supportive of the company's technical innovations, had transformed under her leadership into a driving force for growth. Her relationship with Jonathan remained strictly professional, though tensions simmered beneath every interaction, electric and unresolved. Rainy days were the worst. Whenever storms rolled in over Manhattan, the sound of raindrops against windows would send them both into momentary trances. The memory of that night in 1858, the elevator rushing back with sensory precision, the sound of water against glass, the feel of skin on skin, the suspension of all boundaries in darkness. On such days, their eyes would meet across conference tables with a shared knowledge that no one else in the room could possibly understand. Victoria had formed an alliance with Richard Blackwood, a senior board member who resented Jonathan's leadership and Nicole's rising influence. Richard had been with the company since its founding, a friend of Jonathan's father who had expected to assume control when the elder Silva stepped down. Jonathan's unexpected aptitude for business had thwarted those plans, relegating Richard to an oversight role rather than operational leadership. Though Richard's board position meant he wasn't often physically present at headquarters, he maintained an executive office on the 48th floor for his weekly visits, strategically positioned to observe company operations while maintaining the appearance of appropriate governance distance. His irregular but authoritative presence made him particularly dangerous, an influential figure whose occasional appearances carried outsized impact. Outside, a gentle summer rain had tapped against the windows, nature providing a subtle soundtrack to the human machinations unfolding within. She went from interview to director in record time, Victoria commented to Richard over lunch in the executive dining room, her voice pitched low but carrying just enough for a passing assistant to overhear, a calculated indiscretion. "Don't you find that suspicious?" Rain streaked the dining room windows, transforming the city beyond into a watercolor of blurred edges and bleeding colors. The weather had been unsettled for days, brief showers giving way to humid sunshine before clouds gathered again to release their burden in fits and starts. Richard's eyes narrowed as he cut his steak with precise movements that suggested controlled aggression. Jonathan has always been so careful. What makes her different? Perhaps they knew each other before, Victoria suggested, stirring her tea with deliberate motions. Outside, the rain intensified momentarily, droplets striking the glass with percussive urgency before settling back into a gentle patter. Or perhaps something happened during that storm when they were conveniently trapped together. The insinuation hung in the air between them, gaining substance from their shared willingness to believe the worst. Neither mentioned the other possibility, that Nicole's rapid rise might be due to genuine talent and measurable results. Such an admission would undermine the narrative they were constructing, one droplet of suspicion at a time. Their opportunity came during preparations for the company's biggest product launch of the year. The new Silva quantum processor represented a leap forward in computing technology, and the entire company had been mobilized to ensure its successful introduction to the market. Nicole had stayed late finalizing the presentation that would introduce the product to industry analysts and technology media, her office illuminated long after most others had gone dark. Outside, another summer storm had gathered, rain now falling steadily against her office windows, creating liquid patterns that echoed the night everything had changed. The sound both distracted and comforted her as she worked, each droplet a tiny reminder of connection found and lost in darkness and water. Richard approached her office, his movement deliberately casual as he leaned against her doorframe, watching her work. The rain provided background music to his arrival, soft, constant, unremarkable, until one truly listened and heard the subtle power contained in each falling drop, the potential for erosion hidden in gentle persistence. "Working hard as always," he commented, his tone suggesting admiration while his eyes remained calculating. Behind him, the rain continued its gentle assault on the windows, water streaming down glass in ever-changing patterns. "Mr. Blackwood," she acknowledged cautiously, saving her work before giving him her full attention. In the weeks since joining the company, she had learned to read the political landscape with increasing accuracy, recognizing Richard as a potential threat long before his alliance with Victoria had become apparent. "Can I help you with something?" "I've been impressed with your rise here," he said, entering her office without invitation and settling into the chair opposite her desk. The rain intensified slightly, droplets striking the windows with greater urgency, as if trying to warn her of danger approaching. "Very impressed. I wonder, though, what's your ultimate goal?" "To make Silva Enterprises the market leader in our sector," she replied evenly, maintaining professional composure despite the growing sense of unease Richard's presence inspired. Outside, water continued its relentless journey down glass, each droplet following its inevitable path toward Earth. Richard laughed, the sound entirely devoid of humor. "Come now, we're both ambitious people. Is it the position you want, or Jonathan himself?" The rain seemed to pause for a moment, as if holding its breath before resuming with renewed intensity. Lightning flashed in the distance, briefly illuminating Richard's face in stark relief. The predatory assessment in his eyes, the false smile that never reached them. Nicole stiffened, her professionalism momentarily cracking to reveal genuine anger beneath. "I don't know what you're implying. Only that sleeping with the CEO is certainly an effective career strategy," he said casually, examining his manicured nails with affected indifference. The storm outside provided dramatic punctuation to his words, thunder rumbling in the distance like a warning too late to heed. "Though risky if discovered." "That's completely inappropriate," Nicole responded, standing to signal the conversation's end. The rain beat against the windows with increasing force, driven sideways now by gusts of wind that moaned around the building's corners. "If you'll excuse me." "Think about your future here," Richard continued, unmoving despite her clear dismissal. Lightning flashed again, closer now, briefly transforming the rain-streaked windows into brilliant displays of electric blue before plunging the room back into the muted glow of office lighting. "Jonathan is brilliant but isolated. The board has concerns. Aligning yourself with broader company interests might be wiser long-term." The implied threat hung between them, clear as the rain that continued to fall outside, steady, relentless, gradually accumulating until it could no longer be ignored. Richard left her office without waiting for a response, confident that his message had been received, that seeds of doubt and fear had been successfully planted. After he left, Nicole sat shaking with anger, the storm outside mirroring her inner turmoil. Rain lashed the windows with renewed fury, water streaming down glass in chaotic patterns that suggested all order. All structure could be dissolved by sufficient force applied over time. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having passed during the night, leaving the city washed clean and glistening in the summer sunshine. No trace remained of the tempest, except scattered puddles that reflected the blue sky with perfect clarity, nature's mirrors showing a world transformed, if only temporarily, by the passage of water. Jonathan called her into his office before she had even settled at her desk. His expression was thunderous as he slid a folder across his immaculate desk, the storm from the previous night seemingly transferred from the sky to his features. Behind him, windows still bore trace evidence of rain, small streaks and smudges on otherwise pristine glass. "Explain this," he demanded, his voice containing none of the warmth she had once heard in darkness, none of the vulnerability glimpsed in unguarded moments. Inside were printouts of what appeared to be emails from her account to a competitor, offering to share Silva's upcoming launch strategy in exchange for a position. The messages were dated recently. Their content included proprietary details about the quantum processor that only someone with insider access would know. What made them particularly damning was the digital trail, login records, access timestamps to secure servers, and even a history of visits to competitor websites from her company laptop. "These are fabricated," she said immediately, her mind racing to understand the sophisticated extent of the sabotage. "I would never—" "They came from your account," Jonathan interrupted, his face a mask of controlled fury that revealed nothing of the man who had held her during another storm, another night. The IT department confirmed the access logs, the server timestamps, even the keystroke patterns from your workstation. The security team found confidential files downloaded to a private drive that was accessed with your credentials. Nicole's shock deepened as she realized the complexity of the frame-up. Someone must have planted this evidence. This is a coordinated attack, Jonathan. Think about who would have both the technical expertise and the motive. Outside, the sky remained clear, sunshine streaming through the windows in stark contrast to the darkness gathering within. No rain fell to provide soundtrack or metaphor, no water-streaked glass to suggest the fluid nature of truth and perception. Only unforgiving light illuminated them both, harsh in its clarity, merciless in its revelation. "Someone must have accessed my computer," Nicole insisted, struggling to maintain composure as her professional world threatened to collapse around her. "Jonathan, you know me." "Do I?" he asked coldly, the question cutting deeper than he could possibly know. "We spent one night together in an elevator. That hardly constitutes knowing someone." The words stung more than Nicole expected, their dismissal of what had passed between them. The vulnerable confessions, the genuine connection, more painful than the professional accusation. "If you believe I'm capable of this, then you never knew me at all." As she turned to leave, dignity the only thing she had left to preserve, Jonathan called after her, his voice resuming the impersonal tone of the CEO addressing a subordinate. "You're suspended pending investigation. Security will escort you out." Victoria was waiting outside his office, concern expertly feigned as she watched security walk Nicole to the elevator, the same elevator where everything had begun. The coincidence seemed cruel, a mockery of the connection that had formed in darkness and storm, now ending in harsh light and false accusations. As the elevator doors closed, separating her from the company she had briefly called home, Nicole caught a final glimpse of Victoria's expression, satisfaction poorly disguised as professional regret. In that moment, understanding crystallized with perfect clarity. The trap had been expertly laid, each element calculated for maximum effect. Richard's threat, the fabricated emails, the timing of the accusation. The elevator descended smoothly, its glass wall offering a panoramic view of a city bathed in sunshine, a world washed clean by last night's rain, while human machinations remained as murky as ever. No storm raged now to mirror her inner turmoil, No rain fell to mask the tears that threatened, despite her determination to maintain dignity. When she reached the lobby, the security guard, a different one from the night of the storm, held the door for her with uncomfortable politeness, his expression revealing that news of her disgrace had already spread. Outside, sunshine mocked her turmoil, the clear sky offering no sympathy, no dramatic backdrop to match the collapse of the career she had worked so hard to build. A single drop of water fell on her cheek as she stood on the sidewalk outside Silva Tower. Not rain, but a tear she hadn't realized she had shed, the only external evidence of the storm raging within, as she contemplated how quickly everything could change, how easily trust could be broken, how thoroughly one might be known yet not known at all. Chapter 8. Painful Separation. For 2 weeks, Nicole fought to clear her name. Her appeals to the board were blocked, her calls to Jonathan went unanswered, and her professional reputation hung in the balance as rumors spread through the industry with the speed and destructiveness of wildfire. Summer heat had settled over the city, the skies relentlessly clear, as if nature itself had abandoned the rain that might have provided some comfort, some connection to the night that had changed everything. In her apartment, surrounded by rejected job applications and unanswered emails, she finally accepted that her career might be irreparably damaged. The fabricated evidence had been convincing, the narrative of ambitious betrayal too easily believed by an industry always hungry for scandal. Victoria and Richard had played their parts masterfully, ensuring that her suspension had transformed into effective termination without the legal complications of formal dismissal. Outside her window, the city continued its relentless rhythm, people hurrying along sun-drenched sidewalks, traffic flowing through streets that showed no trace of the storms that had once turned them into temporary rivers. Only occasionally would brief summer showers pass through, the briefest reminder of that night in the elevator, droplets against glass creating fleeting patterns that vanished almost as quickly as they formed. A prestigious firm in London had offered her a position far below her qualifications, but perhaps her only chance at a fresh start in an industry where reputation was currency, and hers had been deliberately devalued. The thought of leaving New York created an unexpected ache, not for the city itself, but for the possibility that had briefly existed within it, a connection found and lost in darkness and rain. Meanwhile, Jonathan buried himself in work, ignoring the hollow feeling that had settled in his chest since Nicole's departure. The product launch had proceeded without her, achieving moderate success but lacking the brilliance her strategies had promised. Something vital seemed missing from the company atmosphere, an energy, a creativity, a human element that had briefly flourished under her influence before being deliberately uprooted. The summer days stretched long and hot, sunlight streaming through his office windows with merciless clarity that offered no shadows in which to hide, no gentle filters to soften the harsh edges of reality. He found himself watching the sky with unreasonable hope for rain, for the comfort of water against glass that might connect him, however tenuously, to the night when boundaries had dissolved completely. Late one night, he found himself reviewing security footage from the night before Nicole's suspension, a habit he'd developed, searching for evidence that might confirm or refute her claims of innocence. The product launch preparations had consumed most of his attention in the weeks following her departure, but something in her final words had lodged in his mind, a splinter of doubt he couldn't extract despite his attempts to focus solely on corporate concerns. This time, something caught his attention. Victoria entering Nicole's office after hours, her movements furtive as she sat at Nicole's computer. The timestamp showed 11:43 p.m., precisely when the fabricated emails had allegedly been sent. He watched as Victoria inserted a flash drive, typed rapidly for several minutes, then carefully restored the workstation to its previous state before leaving, checking the hallway in both directions to ensure she remained unobserved. A cold certainty settled over him as he replayed the footage multiple times, ensuring there could be no misinterpretation. He had been manipulated, his own insecurities weaponized against him, against Nicole. He leaned back in his chair, removing his glasses to rub his eyes. The realization brought no satisfaction, only a hollow ache for time wasted, trust betrayed, connection severed. When confronted with the footage the next morning, Victoria crumbled quickly, her carefully constructed facade of professional concern dissolving under the weight of irrefutable evidence. She implicated Richard in their scheme, revealing a conspiracy motivated by resentment of Jonathan's leadership and fear of Nicole's growing influence. Both were terminated immediately, corporate security escorting them from the building with the same efficient politeness that had once removed Nicole. The victory felt hollow as Jonathan stood at his office window, watching rain clouds finally gathering on the horizon after weeks of relentless sunshine. The approaching storm seemed an appropriate backdrop to his thoughts, to the recognition that he had failed to trust his own instincts, had allowed professional paranoia to override personal connection. He tried calling Nicole again. No answer. The call went straight to voicemail, her professional greeting giving no hint of the woman he had known briefly in darkness and rain. He left a message explaining what he had discovered, offering reinstatement, apology, the vindication she deserved. The words felt inadequate even as he spoke them, clinical language attempting to address a wound that went deeper than professional reputation. His assistant informed him that Nicole had accepted a position abroad. She was leaving in 2 days, departing JFK on the morning flight to London, information acquired through the same corporate surveillance system that had finally revealed Victoria's treachery, an irony not lost on Jonathan as rain finally began to fall against his office windows. Water streaked the glass in familiar patterns, droplets racing each other downward just as they had on the elevator wall months ago. The storm had arrived too late to provide comfort, too late to serve as backdrop to connection rather than separation. Jonathan watched the rain with an ache he couldn't name, recognizing something essential had been lost, something beyond corporate success or professional alliance. For the first time in his adult life, Jonathan Silva found himself completely uncertain about what to do next. The patterns he had established over years, rational analysis, cost-benefit evaluation, emotional detachment, offered no guidance in this situation where logic and feeling had become hopelessly entangled. The rain continued to fall outside his window, water streaming down glass in ever-changing patterns that suggested possibilities, alternate paths, choices not yet made. In her apartment, Nicole packed methodically, sorting her life into categories: keep, discard, ship later. The process was familiar from previous career moves, the physical organization providing comfort when emotional clarity remained elusive. Outside, rain had begun to fall, droplets striking her windows in a gentle percussion that echoed the night in the elevator, each sound a tiny reminder of connection found and lost. She paused, holding a business card Jonathan had given her after her interview. Before the storm, before the elevator, before everything had changed and changed again. The embossed lettering caught the light as rain shadows danced across its surface, water streaming down the window in patterns that seemed to whisper of roads not taken, choices not made, words not spoken. Her phone rang. Jonathan again. The fourth call that day. She let it go to voicemail, uncertain what could possibly be said to bridge the gulf that had opened between them. Professional vindication, even if offered, couldn't address the deeper wound, the dismissal of what they had shared, the easy acceptance of her betrayal when trust should have been the legacy of that night. Outside, the rain intensified, water striking her windows with increasing urgency, as if trying to deliver a message she wasn't yet ready to receive. Nicole turned away, continuing her packing with renewed determination. London represented a fresh start, an opportunity to rebuild her career far from the complications and pain that New York now represented. As she folded another blouse into her suitcase, her phone chimed with a voicemail notification. Jonathan's message explained what he had discovered, offered reinstatement, vindication, apology, all the professional remedies she had sought during those first desperate weeks. What it didn't offer was acknowledgement of the personal connection, the recognition that what had been broken went deeper than professional reputation. Nicole set down the phone, moving to the window to watch rain transforming the city outside, water washing away summer dust, revealing colors made vibrant by moisture, creating temporary rivers that would vanish when the storm passed, leaving only scattered puddles as evidence of transformation. Her ticket to London sat on the kitchen counter, one-way passage to a new beginning, departure scheduled for the day after tomorrow. The rain continued to fall outside her window, each droplet carrying its own momentum, following its inevitable path downward toward earth. Nicole pressed her palm against the cool glass, feeling the vibration of water striking the other side. Separation measured in millimeters, yet impossible to breach. Connection simultaneously close and unattainable. In the gathering darkness of approaching evening, as rain continued to fall across a city about to lose and gain and lose again, two people stood at different windows watching the same storm, both understanding too late that some boundaries, once crossed, leave permanent marks, invisible lines that can never be uncrossed, only acknowledged or denied as paths diverge and reconnect in patterns as fluid and unpredictable as water finding its way down glass. Chapter 9. Truth Revealed. The annual Silva Foundation Charity Gala arrived, an event Jonathan had always approached as a business obligation rather than a celebration. This year, however, it felt particularly empty as he moved mechanically through the crowded ballroom, accepting congratulations for the company's recent successes, while feeling strangely disconnected from achievements that once would have provided complete satisfaction. Outside, rain fell steadily, droplets striking the ballroom's floor-to-ceiling windows in gentle percussion that seemed to mock the artificial gaiety within. Water streaked the glass in familiar patterns, creating distorted reflections of the glittering crowd. Manhattan's elite dressed in their finest, raising crystal flutes to toast success, while remaining comfortably insulated from the elements outside. Jonathan found himself drawn repeatedly to those windows, watching rain transforming the city beyond into a dreamscape of blurred lights and liquid movement. Each droplet against the glass served as tiny reminder of another rain, another night, connection found and lost in darkness and storm. He had left multiple messages for Nicole over the past 24 hours, each one increasingly personal, increasingly urgent as her departure date approached, but had received no response. His reflection stared back at him from the rain-streaked glass. The successful CEO in perfect black tie, the visible embodiment of achievement that felt hollow without the connection he had briefly experienced before allowing professional paranoia to sever it completely. Behind him, the gala continued in full swing, a carefully orchestrated display of wealth and influence that suddenly seemed performative rather than genuine, a simulacrum of success rather than its reality. Midway through the evening, Jonathan excused himself from a conversation with investors to check an urgent message from his head of cybersecurity. He stepped into a quiet alcove reading the report that had just been completed. A forensic analysis of the security breach that had led to Nicole's framing had found sophisticated digital fingerprints. The investigation had uncovered a trail of deliberate evidence manipulation that originated from within the executive suite. Attached to the report were surveillance logs showing Victoria accessing Nicole's workstation after hours on multiple occasions. More damning still were recovered text messages between Victoria and Richard discussing their plan in detail, messages they thought had been permanently deleted but had been recovered from server backups during the routine security audit. As Jonathan processed this information, he noticed Victoria watching him from across the room, her expression changing from confidence to concern as she registered the phone in his hand, the report he was clearly reading. When their eyes met, understanding passed between them. She knew she had been discovered. Victoria immediately headed for the exit, moving with purpose through the crowded ballroom. Jonathan followed, catching up with her in a private corridor away from the main event. "It's over, Victoria," he said quietly, holding up his phone with the evidence displayed. "The security team reconstructed everything. I know what you and Richard did." Her composed facade cracked, revealing the bitterness beneath. "You wouldn't have looked twice at that evidence if it had been anyone else," she said, her voice low but intense. "What made her so special that you launched a full security investigation after she was gone?" The question hit with uncomfortable precision, forcing Jonathan to confront his own inconsistency. Outside, rain began to fall, droplets striking the corridor windows in gentle rhythm that seemed to emphasize this moment of truth. 3 days later, the business press erupted with news of Victoria Hayes and Richard Blackwood being removed from Silva Enterprises amid allegations of corporate espionage and evidence tampering. A carefully worded statement from the company mentioned serious ethical violations without specific details, but industry insiders quickly connected the dots to Nicole Peters' abrupt departure weeks earlier. The Securities and Exchange Commission opened an inquiry into Richard's board activities, particularly focusing on communications with competitors during sensitive product development phases. Victoria, meanwhile, found herself essentially blacklisted after Jonathan's private calls to key industry figures, not explicitly warning them against hiring her, but casually mentioning the unfortunate situation in ways that effectively closed doors throughout the corporate world. Justice, Jonathan discovered, didn't feel as satisfying as he'd expected. The damage had been done to the company's morale, to Nicole's reputation, and most significantly, to the trust that had briefly existed between them. Murmurs spread through the crowd as Jonathan guided Victoria toward a side room, away from curious eyes that drank in the spectacle with barely disguised eagerness. Rain beat against the windows with increasing intensity, providing dramatic backdrop to the scene. Water streaming down glass in chaotic patterns that mirrored the disorder Victoria had brought into the carefully controlled environment. Once they were alone, Jonathan dropped the pretense of concern, anger finally breaking through his controlled facade. "You framed her because you were jealous?" he demanded, professional restraint abandoned in the face of personal betrayal. Victoria laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and broken in the small room. Outside, rain lashed the windows as if demanding entrance, water striking glass with percussive force that seemed to emphasize each word spoken within. "I framed her because she was changing you, changing the company. Richard saw it too. Your priorities shifting." "What are you talking about?" Jonathan's confusion was genuine, his understanding of his own transformation far less clear than its visibility to those who had known him for years. "5 years, Jonathan," Victoria said, swaying slightly as she paced the small room. Rain created moving shadows across her face, water streaming down the windows in patterns that resembled tears. Genuine, unlike the mascara tracks on her cheeks. "I worked beside you for 5 years, watching you build walls around yourself. Then she spends one night with you, and suddenly you're rewriting protocol, considering work-life balance initiatives, smiling in meetings." She stopped pacing, turning to face him directly, her expression a complex mixture of resentment and something almost like grief. "She was making you vulnerable." The realization hit him with stunning clarity as rain continued its assault on the windows, each droplet a tiny emphasis to the truth being revealed. Nicole hadn't been changing the company. She had been changing him. And rather than recognizing it as growth, he had retreated in fear when the first test came, had allowed suspicion to override the trust that should have been the legacy of that night in the elevator. "Where is she now?" he asked, already knowing the answer but needing confirmation, needing the finality of spoken truth. "London," Victoria replied, a hint of satisfaction still evident despite her current disgrace. "Her flight leaves tomorrow morning." The rain provided perfect accompaniment to the moment, water streaming down glass in patterns that suggested time passing, opportunities disappearing, connections severed by distance and misunderstanding. Each droplet followed its inevitable path downward, just as events had followed their course to this moment of clarity that arrived too late to prevent loss, perhaps too late to repair damage already done. For the first time in his life, Jonathan Silva walked out in the middle of a company event, leaving whispers and speculation in his wake. Outside, the rain greeted him with unexpected gentleness, water falling in steady rhythm that soaked his custom tuxedo within moments of leaving the building's shelter. He welcomed it, turning his face upward to feel droplets striking his skin directly, without the barrier of glass that had separated him from genuine experience for too long. The city around him had been transformed by rain into something fluid and dreamlike, streetlights reflected in puddles creating parallel worlds that existed alongside reality. Water streamed down buildings, collected in gutters, transformed concrete and steel into organic, living entities that breathed and shifted with each passing moment. Jonathan moved through this transformed landscape with new purpose, rain soaking him completely as clarity gradually replaced confusion. In her apartment, Nicole stood at the window watching the same rain transforming the city outside into liquid art. Her packed suitcases stood by the door, ready for tomorrow's departure, her flight to London representing both escape and surrender, leaving behind the complications and pain that New York now represented, but also abandoning the possibility that had briefly existed here. Water streaked her windows in familiar patterns, droplets racing each other downward just as they had on the elevator wall months ago. The storm had returned at last, providing perfect backdrop to departure rather than connection, its soundtrack a gentle reminder of what had been found and lost in darkness and rain. Her phone rang again, Jonathan, the seventh call that day. She had listened to his earlier messages, each one explaining what he had discovered, offering reinstatement, vindication, apology. The professional remedies she had sought during those first desperate weeks now seemed hollow, addressing the surface damage while leaving the deeper wound untouched, the easy dismissal of what they had shared, the broken trust that should have been impossible after that night. This time, she answered, her voice carefully controlled, as rain continued its gentle percussion against her windows. "There's nothing left to say, Jonathan." "There's everything left to say," he replied, his voice different than she remembered, the controlled CEO nowhere present in the raw emotion she heard instead. Rain created a backdrop to his words, water striking different surfaces, creating a complex rhythm that underscored the importance of the moment. "I was wrong, not just professionally. I failed to trust what I knew, what I felt, when it mattered most." Nicole remained silent, watching raindrops trace paths down her window, each one unique yet following the same inevitable journey downward, just as they had on the elevator wall that night. The parallels seemed significant somehow, a reminder that some patterns repeated regardless of time or circumstance. "You changed me," Jonathan continued when she didn't respond. The sound of rain was audible in the background of his call, suggesting he was outside somewhere in the same storm that beat against her windows. "I didn't recognize it until Victoria made me see. That night in the elevator, It wasn't just circumstance. It was the first time in my life I connected with someone completely. And the first time you distrusted that connection completely, Nicole replied, her voice steadier than she felt as rain continued its liquid commentary outside, gentle now, almost sorrowful in its rhythm against glass. Yes, he admitted, the simple acknowledgement more powerful than any elaborate excuse could have been. I've spent my life building systems to avoid vulnerability. Then you came along and made me question everything. It terrified me. The rain seemed to pause for a moment, as if holding its breath, before resuming with renewed gentleness. Nicole pressed her palm against the cool glass of her window, feeling the vibration of water striking the other side. Connection and separation simultaneously represented in the thinnest of barriers. Your flight leaves tomorrow, Jonathan said, not a question but a statement filled with unspoken implications. I'll respect whatever decision you make, but before you go, I need you to know the truth. Not just about Victoria's deception, but about what that night meant, what you meant, what you still mean. Nicole closed her eyes, listening to the rain outside her window and through the phone. The same storm connecting them even as physical distance separated them. The sound created a strange intimacy, reminiscent of the darkness that had allowed truth to emerge that night in the elevator. "Where are you?" she asked finally, opening her eyes to watch water continue its journey down glass, each droplet following paths both inevitable and unique. "Outside your building," he admitted, "completely soaked and probably making a spectacle of myself." Despite everything, Nicole found herself smiling as she moved to the window, looking down to the street below where a figure stood in the rain, phone pressed to ear, face turned upward toward her window. The sight created an ache in her chest, recognition of vulnerability freely chosen rather than accidentally revealed, of barriers deliberately lowered rather than temporarily breached. "Come upstairs," she said softly, watching as he lowered the phone, nodded once, and moved toward the building entrance. Rain continued to fall around him, water streaming down glass in patterns that suggested transformation, renewal, the washing away of what had been to reveal what might yet be. The storm that had begun everything had returned at last, not to witness separation, but to provide backdrop for a different kind of truth. One chosen rather than accidentally revealed, acknowledged rather than denied, embraced rather than feared. Outside, rain continued to transform the city into something fluid and dreamlike, while inside, another kind of transformation waited to begin. Chapter 10. Pursuit. The next morning found Jonathan in a taxi, crawling through New York traffic toward the airport. Rain continued to fall, gentler now than the previous night's downpour, but steady in its persistence, transforming the city into a watercolor painting of blurred edges and reflected light. Water streaked the taxi windows, creating ever-changing patterns that seemed to echo his racing thoughts, clear one moment, chaotic the next. His phone rang constantly, executives concerned about his abrupt departure from the gala, board members questioning his priorities after an emergency meeting had been scheduled, then abruptly canceled, marketing staff seeking direction for the campaign, now missing both its director and the crisis manager who would normally have handled such transitions. He ignored them all, focused only on reaching the international terminal before Nicole's flight departed. Their conversation the previous night had lasted until dawn, truth finally emerging in full, barriers lowered completely, vulnerability embraced rather than feared. They had talked, argued, reconciled, reconnected, but the London position remained a complication neither could dismiss. "It's a good opportunity," she had said as morning approached, rain still falling gently outside her windows. "A fresh start, without the shadow of false accusations." "Your name has been cleared at Silva," Jonathan had countered, watching water continue its journey down glass, each droplet following its inevitable path downward, just as their conversation moved toward its necessary conclusion. "And I need you." The simple admission had hung between them, personal rather than professional, emotional rather than strategic. Nicole had touched his face, the gesture tender yet somehow final. I need to know my success isn't tied to you, to us. London gives me that chance. Now, as the taxi navigated flooded streets toward JFK, Jonathan struggled to formulate arguments he hadn't already made, reasons that might persuade her to stay that went beyond his own desire. The rain created a melancholy backdrop to his thoughts, water striking the vehicle in gentle persistence that matched his determination to reach her before departure. Meanwhile, Nicole sat at her gate, passport in hand, watching raindrops race each other down the vast windows of the international terminal. Each drop followed its own unique path, despite being bound by the same inevitable journey downward, a parallel to her own situation that wasn't lost on her. The choice to leave felt both necessary and painful, a step toward independence that required walking away from connection she had only just reclaimed. Outside, aircraft taxied through rain-slicked runways, their lights blurred by precipitation into soft halos that expanded and contracted as they moved. Water transformed the usual harsh functionality of the airport into something dreamlike and fluid, boundaries softened by rain just as her own carefully maintained walls had dissolved during the night's conversation. When the boarding announcement came, she joined the line, each step forward feeling increasingly like surrender rather than advancement. The rain continued to fall beyond the windows, droplets striking glass in gentle rhythm that seemed to whisper warnings, or perhaps encouragements, in a language just beyond comprehension. Jonathan arrived at the terminal breathless, scanning departure boards frantically. Finding her flight, he raced toward the gate, only to be stopped by security, the barrier between public and secure areas as absolute as the professional boundaries he had once maintained so carefully. "Ticket and ID," the agent demanded, unmoved by Jonathan's obvious distress or the water still dripping from his rain-soaked clothing. "I don't have a ticket. I need to speak to someone before they board." The desperation in his voice attracted attention from nearby travelers, creating an audience for the drama unfolding between wealthy CEO and implacable security protocols. "I'm sorry, sir. No ticket. No access." The agent's polite inflexibility reflected years of training in the immutable rules of airport security, barriers designed specifically to be impervious to wealth, influence, or emotional appeals. Desperation mounting, Jonathan spotted a familiar face among the travelers passing through security, Miguel, a Silva Enterprises employee traveling for business. The recognition was mutual, Miguel's surprise at seeing his CEO soaking wet and clearly distressed at an airport security checkpoint evident in his expression. "Miguel, I need your help," Jonathan said, approaching quickly. The words emerged without consideration of corporate hierarchy or professional appearances, naked need trumping cultivated image for perhaps the first time in Jonathan's career. Miguel hesitated only briefly before understanding the gravity of the situation. "Of course, sir. What can I do?" "I need to reach someone at Gate 38 before boarding completes. It's important." The understatement hung between them, Miguel's glance at his boss's disheveled appearance and desperate eyes filling in the blanks. "I have an idea," Miguel replied, pulling out his phone. He made a quick call to a colleague already past security, speaking rapidly in Spanish. After ending the call, he explained, "My colleague, Carlos, will create a distraction at the TSA checkpoint. When the agents respond, head to the priority lane. Use my boarding pass. We look similar enough in the ID photo. I'll say I misplaced it if questioned." The improvised plan worked with surprising efficiency. When Carlos loudly discovered a forgotten laptop in his bag at the scanner, creating a procedural security response, Jonathan slipped through the priority lane using Miguel's boarding pass and ID. The rushed TSA agent, distracted by the commotion, gave only a cursory glance at the identification before waving him through. Once past security, Jonathan sprinted toward Gate 38, where final boarding for London was underway. He navigated the crowded terminal with single-minded focus, dodging travelers and airport staff who turned to watch the soaking wet man in expensive clothes racing as though his life depended on reaching that gate. "Nicole!" he called, catching sight of her just as she handed her boarding pass to the attendant. The sound echoed through the gate area, heads turning to witness the spectacle of a clearly unauthorized man rushing toward the boarding queue, security personnel already moving to intercept him. She turned, disbelief written across her features as she registered his presence, soaking wet from the rain, breathless from running, utterly unlike the controlled CEO she had known. Their eyes met across the crowded gate area, connection immediate despite the physical distance and security personnel now surrounding him. "Jonathan, what are you doing here?" The question contained multitudes, surprise, concern, something almost like hope quickly suppressed. "Don't go," he said simply, ignoring the security officers now taking his arms. The words emerged without strategy or calculation, raw truth that had finally found voice after months of denial. "Please, sir, you need to come with us," a security officer interrupted, his tone professional but firm as he tightened his grip on Jonathan's arm. The scene had attracted attention throughout the gate area, travelers openly watching the drama unfold with the avid interest of those whose own journeys had temporarily paused. Nicole stepped out of the boarding line, the movement decisive despite its potential consequences. "It's okay," she told the security officer, her composure remarkable given the circumstances. "I know him." When they had a moment of relative privacy, as private as possible in an airport gate area with curious onlookers still watching from a slightly greater distance, Jonathan spoke quickly, aware that their time was limited by both airline schedules and security protocols. Victoria confessed. She and Richard fabricated everything. The words tumbled out, important but somehow secondary to what he really needed to say. Rain continued to fall outside the vast terminal windows, droplets striking glass in patterns that seemed to emphasize the urgency of the moment. "You could have called to tell me that," Nicole replied, hurt still evident in her voice despite the vindication the news represented. The final boarding call sounded behind her, creating deadline and dramatic backdrop simultaneously. "I did call, many times." He ran a hand through his disheveled hair, rainwater still dripping from the expensive cut, now ruined by precipitation and desperate fingers. "But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because I was a coward." Nicole remained silent, waiting, her expression carefully neutral as rain continued to create liquid art against the windows beyond, water streaming down glass in ever-changing patterns that suggested transformation, possibility, paths not yet determined. "That night in the elevator wasn't just circumstance," he continued, the words emerging with increasing urgency as airline staff watched impatiently from the boarding desk. "It was the first time in my life I connected with someone completely, and it terrified me." Around them, the final boarding call sounded again, more insistent this time. Nicole glanced toward the gate, then back to Jonathan, indecision visible in her expression for the first time since he had known her. "I've spent my life building walls, Nicole, creating systems and structures to avoid vulnerability. Then you came along and made me question everything." The admission cost him more than any financial concession ever had, stripped him more completely than any physical vulnerability ever could. Rain continued to fall outside, water streaming down glass in patterns that seemed to underscore the significance of barriers breached, walls demolished. "What are you saying, Jonathan?" The question was softly spoken but direct, demanding clarity rather than implication, truth rather than strategic communication. "I'm saying he faltered, decades of emotional restraint battling against the urgency of the moment. The words he needed seemed foreign, dangerous, territory he'd deliberately avoided his entire adult life. For a moment, the disciplined CEO reasserted control, calculating risks, analyzing vulnerability as a weakness rather than strength. Then he remembered Victoria's words. She was making you vulnerable. The accusation that had initially seemed like criticism now revealed itself as the precise truth he needed to embrace. "I'm saying I love you," he finally managed, the declaration emerging not with practiced smoothness, but with raw authenticity that surprised even himself. His voice caught slightly on the unfamiliar phrase, not from uncertainty about its truth, but from the seismic shift it represented in how he understood himself. "And I'm asking you to stay, not for the company, for me." Nicole studied his face, seeing the shy, vulnerable man from the elevator rather than the controlled CEO, the person revealed in darkness and storm rather than the persona constructed for daylight and business. Rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows beyond, water creating ever-changing patterns that suggested possibility, transformation, paths not yet chosen. "I need to know," she said quietly, the question containing layers of meaning beyond its simple words. "Do you trust me?" "With everything," he replied without hesitation, the answer emerging from certainty rather than calculation, from heart rather than strategy. The security officers approached again, their patience clearly waning despite the human drama unfolding before them. "Ma'am, are you boarding this flight?" Nicole looked from Jonathan to the jetway and back again, decision crystallizing in her expression as rain continued to fall outside, droplets striking glass in patterns that seemed to echo the choices being made within, paths chosen rather than followed, connections embraced rather than feared. "No," she said finally, the simple word containing complex implications for career, future, heart. "I'm not boarding today." As they left the gate together, rain continued to transform the world outside into something fluid and dreamlike, water streaming down glass in patterns that suggested new possibilities, alternate paths, choices made and yet to be made. Inside, another kind of transformation had already begun, boundaries acknowledged rather than denied, vulnerability embraced rather than feared, connection chosen rather than accidentally discovered in darkness and storm. Chapter 11. Reconciliation. 3 weeks later, Silva Enterprises announced Nicole Peters' reinstatement as marketing director, along with a public apology for the misunderstanding that had led to her temporary departure. Industry analysts noted the unusual transparency from a company previously known for its guarded communication style. Behind closed doors, the reconciliation between Nicole and Jonathan evolved carefully. Professional boundaries were re-established during office hours, their relationship kept strictly separate from company business. After work, however, they began the delicate process of truly knowing each other beyond the intensity of their first encounter. Dinners at quiet restaurants, weekend walks through the city, conversations that stretched late into the night, each interaction building something deeper than passion. "I've never done this before," Jonathan admitted one evening as they sat on his penthouse balcony overlooking the city. A gentle rain had just begun, droplets creating ripples in their wine glasses. "Dating?" Nicole asked with a smile. "Being known," he clarified, watching city lights refract through raindrops on the glass. That night in the elevator, it wasn't the physical aspect that changed me. It was the strange alchemy that happens when darkness removes every visual cue, when a crisis strips away pretense. He smiled slightly, remembering. "In board meetings, I can read the political calculations behind every comment. In that elevator, all I had were your words and the honesty in your voice. For the first time since I was a child, I wasn't performing a role, the dutiful son, the focused CEO, the public philanthropist. I was just me." Nicole took his hand. "I like just you best of all." The company began to reflect their partnership. Jonathan remained the strategic visionary, but now incorporated Nicole's insights about human connection and motivation. When the board questioned the changes, Jonathan stood firm. We're balancing innovation with sustainability, excellence with well-being. The results speak for themselves. And they did. Under their joint influence, Silva Enterprises achieved record growth without the burnout and turnover that had previously been accepted as inevitable costs of success. 6 months after the elevator incident, they returned to the building late one night. Maintenance had completed renovations on the entire elevator system, a project Jonathan had personally overseen. "Why are we here?" Nicole asked as they stood in the empty lobby. Jonathan pressed the call button. "Unfinished business." The elevator that arrived was familiar yet transformed, the same space where everything had begun, now modernized and improved. As the doors closed, Jonathan pressed the emergency stop button. "What are you doing?" Nicole laughed. "Creating a moment," he replied, dropping to one knee and producing a small velvet box. "Nicole Peters, you changed my life in this elevator. Will you continue changing it as my wife?" The ring inside was stunning yet understated, like the man offering it, Nicole thought. Complex, valuable, and showing its true brilliance only to those who looked closely. "Yes," she answered simply, pulling him to his feet and into her arms. Their kiss echoed their first, passion tempered now with deeper understanding and the certainty of chosen commitment rather than circumstantial connection. Chapter 12. New Beginnings. 1 year after the storm that had changed everything, guests gathered on the rooftop of Silva Tower for a wedding unlike any the New York business world had seen. Where they had expected ostentation befitting a billionaire, they found instead thoughtful intimacy, a celebration focused on connection rather than display. Jonathan stood watching as Nicole walked toward him, radiant in a gown that captured both strength and grace. Her family occupied the front row. Michael, the brother she had helped through medical school, who now served in an under-resourced clinic in the Bronx. Tasha, the sister whose art college tuition Nicole had secretly paid while telling her it was a scholarship, and youngest brother David, just starting his engineering degree with the same determination that characterized all the Peters siblings. They beamed proudly as she took her place beside the man few had ever truly known before her. "We gather here," the officiant began, "to celebrate not just the union of two people, but the courage it takes to be truly known and truly loved." As they exchanged vows, a subtle rumble of thunder rolled across the distant horizon, a gentle echo of the storm that had first brought them together. Some guests glanced nervously at the sky, but Nicole and Jonathan merely smiled at each other, comfortable with the symbolism. The reception that followed celebrated not just their love, but the transformation it had inspired. Silva Enterprises employees noted how their CEO moved comfortably through conversations now, his bride never far from his side, their complementary strengths creating a harmony that extended beyond their personal relationship. Late in the evening, they slipped away from the festivities, taking a private elevator down to the lobby. This elevator, the one from that fateful night, had been specially decorated for the occasion with subtle lighting and the scent of jasmine. "Full circle," Nicole commented as the doors closed. Jonathan pressed the button for the 37th floor, where they had first stopped that night. "New beginning," he corrected, taking her hand. When the doors opened again, they stepped out into a newly renovated space, a charitable foundation office dedicated to supporting underprivileged students interested in business and technology. "The Nicole Peters Silva Foundation," Jonathan announced. "Your passion for helping others, my resources. The first of many collaborations that extend beyond business." Nicole explored the space with growing emotion, recognizing how perfectly it represented their shared vision, ambitious yet grounded in human connection. "It's perfect," she whispered, turning back to her husband. As they embraced in the doorway, the storm outside intensified, rain beginning to streak the windows. Neither noticed, too absorbed in the certainty that whatever weather came, they would face it together. No longer trapped by circumstance, but bound by choice, passion transformed into enduring love. Outside, lightning illuminated the city skyline as another power outage rolled across the district. Inside, they smiled in the sudden darkness, entirely at home in the storm. The end. Please don't forget to share your thoughts on my efforts. Did you like my story? Comment below.